how's it going? So today we're going to look at episode 2 of season 2 of House of the Dragon. Have some first impressions, just go through scene by scene, and a wee bit of analysis too for you. So in this first scene, we pick up right after we left off in episode 1, right after the murder of Prince Jaehaerys, and basically what we get is this initial scene with the handmaiden coming from his room with his blanket soaked in blood, and then immediately after we have all of the Kingsguard and the City Watch going and rounding up the small folk who work within the Red Keep and taking them away to a secure holding space while they try and establish what's happened, what's going on, and who has infiltrated the room. This is then immediately followed by the scene of Aegon's reaction upon finding out of the death of his son Prince Jaehaerys and his heir in his stead to the Iron Throne. And it's a very, very graphic scene of just pure abject anger, and this complete outpouring of rage, grief as rage. And in this scene, he's smashing up Viserys's model of Valyria that he had built, and his companions that were at the end of episode 1 when he was drinking in the throne room are all also there trying to calm him down, trying to quell his rage slightly, and be reasonable and rational. But Aegon does not want to hear it. He's proclaiming that Team Black are liars and murderers and traitors to the crown, and essentially establishes that there is no turning back from this, and he declares war. Something that I find really interesting about this scene in particular, with this whole model of Valyria and him just utterly devastating it, is this idea that Valyria, was the stronghold of their family, and the Dance of the Dragons really signals the downfall of the Targaryen line and the civil war that erupts from it. So really, these are pivotal scenes that lead to this complete destruction of a line. And furthermore, when you think about, the downfall of Valyria and the Doom and how it came about, there are a lot of different theories obviously floating about that, but one of the things that kind of is highlighted seems to be this idea of hubris brought the downfall of Valyria, and we see that in multiple stories of ancient civilizations that were eventually brought to their end, that hubris always kind of plays a role, and this idea of having this massive amount of unrivaled power and seeing that you can't have this fall from grace from that. And it's going to be interesting to see how this kind of relates to Aegon's story in the future. And on top of that, I think there's more beyond the idea of this destruction of a realm, and the fact that he's going to plunge Westeros into a civil war completely and entirely now at this stage and cause this destruction on a local scale to there is more of an interpersonal type of level to this as well, whenever you consider his relationship with his father, who so painstakingly spent many, many years putting this together, spending time on it, commissioning works for it, and he probably looked at this with some sort of almost like a sibling jealousy that his father spent all his time and devoted all his adoration and love and care to the construction of this model, whereas his father devoted no love and care to him, and didn't spend time preparing him for life as a royal, even if he wasn't the chosen heir for Viserys. He wasn't even prepared for any type of role in court. He had absolutely no training to take on any role of power or have any type of responsibility, because his father essentially neglected him, whereas he invested a lot of time and love and money and resources into this model, this toy. So in the scene immediately following this, we have Prince Aemond coming into his room and realizing that this secret door has been opened and left opened, which is very shoddy work, but are we surprised? But he establishes essentially that this is the entry point to where the intruders came into the Red Keep. And we see it in a later scene that because he says nothing during the scene, he's completely silent, and we don't really see all that much of a reaction in terms of the news of his nephew being murdered and beheaded, and the suffering that his two siblings are going to be going through at the loss of a child. He doesn't seem to actually have very much of a reaction, which could be to be expected based on his characterization thus far. But as we see in a future scene, he's a bit more sensitive than we might give him credit for. But he definitely doesn't display any of that in this scene. He obviously realizes at this point that the assassins were sent probably for him. And he, has this further confirmed in a sense when he reaches below his desk. He obviously realizes that, the coins that they had on their war planning map have been removed, stolen, and he notices one of them still on the floor, so he picks this up. But this is just, further in the point that these people were very opportunistic, and if they had have come into the room and seen that he wasn't there, they might have supplemented him with his nephew, the Prince Jaehaerys. So then in the next scene, we see Alicent, her outpouring of grief and her reaction to her grandchild being murdered. And this is all expressed to Otto, who is being somewhat sympathetic in his own special way. But it's more of, she needs a soundboard that she can project her grief and guilt onto. And she really is going for it with this whole feeling of responsibility, feeling of guilt because of her actions at the time that this was happening. Obviously she was abed with Kristen Cole, and she expresses that she believes the gods are punishing her. And I think something that she said that was really interesting was that the child is dead, that his suffering is over. Does that just relate to the immediate suffering of the moments where he was getting beheaded, or does that mean his duties to the royal court? Hard to say. But then we also see this first time that we're really introduced to how ridiculously ambitious and opportune Otto was. And obviously we've seen a lot of that at the Green Council episode of season 1, but where he's talking about this child, his great grandson, having just been murdered in a brutal fashion, he turns around and says some good may yet come of this situation, which really, and obviously expands on this later in the episode as we see, but this is just absolutely gut-wrenching. Like, the first time that I heard it, even though it was coming from Otto, and even though we've seen him do very similar things in the past, he was completely opportune in the death of King Viserys, but there was something so gut-wrenching about him saying this about the death of a child, and especially a child that was within his family. I cannot express in words how much Tom Glencarney has made me empathetic of the character of Aegon II, and it's absolutely disgusting, but here we go. So the next scene is Aegon entering his small council and having an absolute meltdown. He's, again, smashing things, throwing things. He's getting up in all of his councillors' faces. He starts making accusations, asking people where they were at the time and why they weren't there. And when Larys enters the room, he, declares, "We have found someone who is potentially involved, and I have them in the cells." And Aegon immediately is like, "I'm going to kill him myself," and starts walking towards, and has to be stopped by Kristen Cole. At which point his council give him very good counsel and say, we should probably try and gather some intelligence before you go and murder this man, and see if anyone else is involved, or if it's potentially not from who you think it is, because he's very blatantly like, this is from Rhaenyra, it's her, she's done it. Whereas everyone else is like, you may have more enemies than you think, so maybe let's not jump to conclusions and go and try and gather some information before we jump head first into murder. And we haven't, I'm not sure, it hasn't been confirmed, within the show, or I think source material at this stage, whether Aegon has killed anyone before, but it would make perfect sense for his first kill to be the person who's just killed his son and heir. Following this exchange with Larys, he ends up coming back and sitting at the table, essentially because he wants to act, and he says he doesn't want to be seen as weak. And Otto says, you're already seen as weak. like, you were hastily coronated, and during this coronation a dragon bursts up through the ground, kills thousands of people, flies off and escapes the Red Keep, and that the people in King's Landing are whispering, saying that this is a bad omen and that maybe Rhaenyra should be queen. And as soon as Aegon hears this, he has an immediate outpouring of rage, but then takes his seat, and you can see this shift between this really infuriated, inflamed man, where he kind of sits down and it goes internal. He starts looking, at this identification of his grief and what he's going to do with that, because he wants to just act impulsively, but those around him are preventing him from doing so. So we have this, kind of shift in character, and Otto kind of takes over at this stage and starts planning for him, and says about wanting to do the funeral for Jaehaerys, and how the child is going to do more for them now than 1,000 men. And Aegon actually shows some good responsible parenting and care and love for his son, and says he doesn't want this for him. He doesn't want his son paraded through the town, not his son's corpse. And he looks to his mother for some sort of support in the situation, and the way that the actor portrays this is, this really gentle turn, and he really softly says mother, asking her to come to his aid in this situation, but she doesn't. She instead takes the side of her father Otto and says that they probably should do this, because it will display to the small folk who are questioning Aegon and considering should Rhaenyra have been queen, it'll display to them that Rhaenyra is Rhaenyra the Cruel, the title of the episode, and that she can't be trusted with power, because if she would do this to her own family, what would she do to the small folk should they disobey her? So following the Green Council scene, Alicent goes to visit Helena. And when I tell you, I am the biggest Helena defender you will find. I will go to war for this woman. My heart absolutely broke for her in the last episode, and it breaks for her in this episode. And when I first seen this shot of her sitting and she's hugging on to the piece of cloth that she was embroidering in the first episode, the one I mentioned in the last video, that it ends up being a shroud in this episode, which we've seen from the club, but it does in future scenes. But in this current moment, she's hugging onto it, she's crying, she's hugging onto the bedpost, and Alicent walks in and explains that they are to have a funeral for the young prince, and she says she doesn't want to. Alicent agrees that she doesn't either, but that it is their royal duty. And Helena, again, she's a neurodivergent character, and she is completely, she is expressing herself very, very diplomatically here, saying she doesn't want to go. She has no interest in doing these diplomatic measures for the sake of the small folk and for the spectacle of it all, and that was her little boy, and she has no interest in doing this. She doesn't want to be there. She's hurt, she's grieving, and she doesn't understand why her mother is asking her to do this, because it doesn't make any sense to her. And it just again shows how pure of a character that she is. She isn't looking at this from the side of politics or for some type of political leverage. She's looking at this as, I am hurt and I'm grieving, and my son is dead, and I'm not going to parade his body, like Aegon said, I'm not going to parade his body through the streets for the spectacle of the people. And then she cuts off Alicent when Alicent starts trying to confess to her, because she's looking for anyone to confess to at this point, anyone who'll listen, that she can go and confess her sins and beg for retribution or beg for redemption. She tries to speak to Helena about it, and Helena is clearly not in the fit mental state to be having this conversation with her mother. So she cuts her off and hands her the fabric and says, "This is for my boy." And that just, it absolutely was heartbreaking, this poor woman and what she's had to go through. And the fact that Alicent wasn't a bit more sympathetic to this, given that in the earlier scene that she had with Otto, and her immediate reaction following the death of Jaehaerys, she says, the child is at peace now, but what they did to my poor girl. And then this is reflected in the dialogue that she then has with Helena, where she is trying to play politics and dictate to her what they have to do because it's their duty to the realm. So the next scene actually takes us to the funeral procession, which is reluctantly going ahead despite the contestation of Alicent and Helena. And it's going ahead for the sake of being a piece of propaganda against Rhaenyra. It was decided at the Green Council scene that we've seen earlier that Aegon should not be present for this, should not be in the public eye at the minute, because he is having such an outward response to his grief, such an enraged response. And instead they put the two women of the family, the grieving mother and grandmother, on a cart behind the young child's corpse, which is being carried through the street. And it shows us this close-up of the child, and I was really concerned of how much they were actually going to show us. I didn't know if they were going to show us at all, given the fact that they cut away in the last episode from the actual beheading itself, which is understandable. It would have been very graphic and it would have put a lot of people off the show. There is also a lot of restrictions around what they can show about child actors. I seen that I think it was Red Team Reviews and Preston Jacobs were talking about this scene and said that even that part where they cover the child's mouth in that brief split second that we do see of him, that had to be the child's father because of the laws around filming with children. So I wasn't sure if we were actually going to get to see the corpse. I'm not sure if it was a prop or if they had makeup put on the child, but the whole way through this scene, when this cart is ricketing around the streets of King's Landing, my heart was in my throat thinking that the head's gonna fall off, that the child was gonna be sitting there, a headless body on top of this, and that Helena was gonna have to witness that again, and Alicent was gonna see from the cart, and that it was just gonna be a whole scene of absolute chaos. So it kept you on edge. It was so anxiety provoking. And the scene that they did show us, this close up shot of the Prince Jaehaerys with his head sewn back on, was so visceral and caused such a reaction of disgust and hurt that it was almost more effective than if they had just given a gratuitously gory scene in episode 1. Saving a scene like this for episode 2 was just really, really shocking, and I almost couldn't believe that they put it in there. And then for every single bump that they had on the road, and having this anticipation, and this feeling of dread and anxiety, is the head gonna come off? And I've seen a lot of people saying that too. They really kept the audience on edge with that. For me anyway, it was more effective than having a really gory scene in the first episode of them beheading him in the first place. This funeral scene is then intercut with these different perspectives of blood in the cell, and Larys going down and rolling out his torture tools, and Blood immediately starts confessing. And a lot of people are kind of talking about this, is he not supposed to be more of a threatening character? Is he not supposed to be more of an intimidating character to immediately have this pitiful look on his face and start confessing to everything that he done? And first and foremost, someone who's going to behead a child for money is not a particularly formidable fellow. So it makes sense that he's a snivelling rat whenever it comes to getting his comeuppance for his actions. And we really see the consequences of this when Larys is like, okay, great, thanks for the information anyway, so here's Prince Aegon, and good luck getting out alive. So by intercutting these scenes, we're able to see the reaction of both father and mother to their grief and the loss of their son and heir, Prince Jaehaerys. And we see this very dark and enraged reaction from Aegon, where he turns murderous in his rage. And we see this intercut with scenes of Helena being really upset and really uncomfortable by the position that she's been put in, and then getting really overstimulated by the crowd. And even though the crowd are saying nice things to her and they're trying to deliver messages of support to her and the royal house, she is just completely and utterly overwhelmed and overstimulated, and she is essentially trapped on top of this carriage that is being surrounded by the small folk, and she has been taken away from the Red Keep, where she sees herself as safe and she's being taken into this, area of unknown with all these people that she doesn't know. And like she references in one of the earlier scenes where she's, talking about her grief and in relation to her proximity to these people that she doesn't know, she will now be seeing that as a place of complete and utter, like, unsafe areas, surrounded by these people that she doesn't know, like the people that just intruded into her house and killed her son. So she is being placed in this, scenario of complete and utter insecurity, whereas Aegon is going down to the cells in a place where he is in complete control and has the utmost authority, and he is going and acting on something that he wishes to do, which is killing the murderer of his son. And Helaena is stuck in this situation that she really doesn't want to be in, but has no option really, because it's being dictated to her that this is her duty. Then we move over to the Black Council, and Rhaenyra is hearing of the murder of her nephew, and she is being told that there are vile accusations being made that it was her who was responsible for the murder of her nephew, to which she responds essentially exactly how I predicted that she would have in my last video, that, it's absolutely absurd to suggest that she would behead a child, like order the beheading of a child, and, especially that she would do this to her own sister, and, that Helena's an innocent and all of this, having this, like, actual on-screen confirmation that even within the scope of the story, within the realm, it is very much recognizable that Helaena is an innocent in this scenario. And, Rhaenyra recognizes this, and it shows that she is considering, those who should be punished are those who are culpable and responsible for committing crimes against her. This is why she was going after Aemond in the first place, because he committed this wrongdoing onto her by, allowing his dragon to murder her son. So then we cut to this scene with Rhaenyra and Daemon in their bed chambers following the council scene, and she is confronting him because she's become suspicious. Throughout the council he was notably quiet and had a very suspicious look on his face, and she notices this and has this confrontation with him then in their bedroom, and she's essentially asking, what did you do? He says that he essentially ordered the assassination of Aemon Targaryen, but no further. She states that she doesn't believe him, that, she essentially gives him the same speech that Miss Arya did in the last episode, that she was once under his spell when she was younger, but now she can look critically at the situation and realizes that he is not the kind of person that she thought that he was, and that she can't save him like her younger self thought that she could, and that he is just the type of person that he is okay with wrongdoing, and he is okay with these actions, despite the fact that to her he repeatedly says this was a mistake. And that's actually the last line of dialogue that they exchange with each other, is him stating this was a mistake. And I think it's very interesting because you can kind of parallel that between, the scene that we got with them and then the scene that we wanted but didn't get, where Aemond is confessing to his family about the murder of Luke. That was also an accident, and these two characters, run parallel to each other throughout the whole story. So I think it's kind of interesting that they chose to go that direction with the story, saying it was also an accident that this happened, that it was a mistake. We're also once again exposed to this abusive dynamic within their relationship, when he aggressively tries to get up from the table when she's speaking to him and she flinches backwards, when he reaches for her neck again and you can see him, his hands hesitating, and then he goes to cup her face instead. And it's just this sort of explosive rage that you can see that he's trying to fight against, but really is also trying to still communicate to her that even though you're my queen, there is still this, like, unbridled rage, this unquenchable thirst for violence within him. And this is their last exchange before he goes off to Harrenhal, and the last words he says in the scene is about how it was a mistake, but this is really their last interaction, is one of violence from him towards her. And once he leaves the room, then his daughter Bela comes in, and Rhaenyra asks her to go and patrol King's Landing on Moondancer, who I'm very excited to see in the next episode. She is the most beautiful dragon that we have seen so far. So sorry to everyone else who disagrees, but you are wrong. We then return to King's Landing, and we see the first interaction between Aegon and Helena since the start of last episode. And, this immediately following the last scenes at King's Landing, where it's intercut between Aegon having his really enraged outward reaction as the father, and Helena as the mother having this, really distressed and disgusted reaction in this place where she's been, put on this cart because she has to do her duty to the realm, whereas he can really act on his impulses because he's the king and he has the agency to do so. So this is the first interaction that we've seen with them. He's coming down the stairs and she's going up the stairs with her handmaidens, and they kind of stop and they exchange this look to each other, and you can tell that she wants something more, that she wants some sort of comfort, some sort of acknowledgement from her husband, and you can tell he is still just in the throes of rage. And so he continues on down the stairs and walks past her, and this again just calls back to the dining scene in season 1, where she says to Bella and Rhaenyra, as they're newly engaged, that it's alright, your husband mostly ignores you. We then go to a scene of Kristen Cole walking into the children's room, and he has this lingering stare at the bed, and the workers of the Red Keep are stripping the bed and they're taking everything off and taking everything apart. They're dismantling the child's cot, and Kristen Cole is watching on while they do this, and then they turn the mattress round and you can see where all the blood has soaked into really the entire top half of the mattress. And suddenly he puts his head down, and for the rest of the scene he can't look at what they're doing. He can't make eye contact with those that are working. Even when they have to pass him, he kind of recoils into the wall. He can't face what has happened and what happened on his watch. Then we have this scene with Rhaenyra with her 2 children, and I think it's really interesting how they kind of show the visuals of every time that Rhaenyra is with her youngest 2 children, Aegon and Viserys, because it's always so similar, showing the image of her with her twins, her youngest twins, and Helena with the twins previously. When you put these 2 scenes side by side, they're almost visually identical to each other. So it kind of calls back to that. And even within this, we have this shot where she's looking up at the dust that's, floating past the window and the lights catching it. And it's really similar and reminiscent to the scene earlier where Helena is at the funeral of her young boy. And there's this, this ash or confetti of some description. They're petals that the small folk are throwing. And she's looking up and just observing as it falls. We then have a couple of scenes with Kristen Cole, the first of which is one with him and Alicent, and she's going in for a bath, and she comes out and says to him, "You haven't told anyone, have you?" And he says, "What do you take me for?" As if he didn't literally tell her upon first question that he had slept with Rhaenyra in season 1. So then Kristen Cole decides he's gonna mosey his way on up to Ark Cargyle, who is, sitting in the dining hall trying to eat. He goes up, he notices that his white cloak has been dirtied, and he confronts him about this, and Arik states that it's because he was out with the funeral procession and it was muddy. But this is not good enough justification for Kristen Cole. He tells him to change it immediately and starts projecting his guilt about the whole situation onto Arik in the most ridiculous and massive and colossal way that he can possibly muster up, and starts giving this whole lecture about how the white cloak, needs to always be clean because it's a symbol of their purity and their fidelity to the crown and the realm, and that it's a complete dishonor to have it sullied, even though he is simply projecting because he has in fact sullied his vow of chastity that he has taken along with his oath. And it's a matter of him trying to deal with this grief by simply blaming others. So, Arik brings up the fact that he is a King's Guard, and why does Helena not have a Queen's Guard? And this just rises up Kristen even more, and ends up with this whole confrontation whereby he states that for him to redeem himself, he has to go and assassinate Rhaenyra by pretending to be his twin. We have this short but nice to include scene of Jace and Bella kind of bonding over the fact that they have complicated relationships with their father figures, and, you know, again, exploring these ideas of grief and how young people are to deal with them, and they're still trying to establish their identity, and also that there is this relationship building going on behind the scenes with these two characters. Then we have what might be the best scene in the whole show. It's Prince Aemond in the brothel, and the initial scene, you know, as we enter the brothel, is this blonde woman dancing, and we've seen it in all the trailers and everyone was trying to figure out who it was. I'm still kind of trying to figure out who it was, because every time I see somebody with platinum blonde hair at all in this show, I kind of assume that there's probably some Targaryen blood there somewhere. So then, you know, we follow this other character who's carrying a tray into this private quarters room, and as we enter this room, we see Prince Aemond curled up in the fetal position in the arms of this older woman, you know, the brothel owner who we've seen at the end of season 1. And, you know, it's implied that he also lost his virginity to her when he's telling the story of how he knows that Aegon frequents this establishment. So it's this older woman that he has this familiarity with, this comfort with. He's in her arms. This, you know, person comes in with the servant tray, and it seems like she's pouring warm milk into a jug for him. It's really going heavy with this whole mommy kink situation, that he has, you know, these very deep-rooted, unresolved mommy issues, that he is, you know, seeking this attention and validation and comfort of an older woman, a maternal figure in this brothel owner who also took his virginity. So he does have that familiarity and that comfort, and they've established some sort of relationship. We're not really sure anything more than that, but it seems that he comes here often enough where he didn't speak a word in the last scene, and he virtually doesn't speak when he's in the company of his family or when he's in the Red Keep, other than to, you know, war plan and strategize. He never really talks about his feelings or has any sort of emotional depth. So this is really a scene that a lot of us were looking for. This is the reaction to, you know, Vhagar killing Luke that we all wanted to see in the last episode. We're finally getting it, and it's in this, you know, strange intimate scene with this woman, and, you know, it's unclear what degree to this interaction, you know, if it was sexual or if it was just purely that he wanted to come and unburden himself. It's also notable that the actual dialogue within the scene doesn't really contain any reference to the death of his nephew Jaehaerys. It's really all about him, you know, talking about initially how delighted he is that Daemon wanted to assassinate him in his bed, declaring that Daemon is scared of him, which is brave. And then after this, he goes into this discussion about how he actually does regret what happened with Luke, and, you know, gives us this information that we already knew, that it comes from him being bullied and he just lost his temper. And a lot of people were like, this was a bit too holding the viewer's hand and walking them through the exposition. But I think it kind of shows that he's like gone into this childlike state, you know, where he's sitting here and all he wants, she tries to kiss him and he backs away and says, no, not here, which is ironic because you're in a brothel. But he backs away and says, no, not here, and instead puts his head on her lap. She's petting his head and talking to him. And it seems like he just wants to use this as a confessional space, as a soundboard, that he, you know, reverts into this childlike state and so starts almost over explaining the situation. It's very peculiar, but it does end with her saying to him, you know, I'm glad that you regret what happened with Luke, but you have to realize that when princes lose their temper, it's the small folk who suffer, small folk like her. And, you know, tries to put into perspective that there are victims to his outbursts of rage beyond just the immediate victims, because now this is, you know, his one action there with Luke is going to turn out to be an all-out civil war, and it is essentially going to be the small folk who are going to pay for that, which is what we've seen repeatedly. We referenced it in the last video, and it's what we've seen again in this episode. So on the topic of how this war is going to affect the small folk, it then cuts to a scene of Hugh and his wife and his sickly daughter, and his wife is talking about how all the food costs have risen and how it's difficult to get any ingredients for food in the first place, and essentially just communicating that the small folk are really struggling at this period in time and that the blockade from the blacks is really not helping. And then it cuts to this scene of Adam and Alan of Hull, and we kind of have that, you know, introduction and this familiarization of these characters, and we kind of get to see that their brotherly dynamic with each other. And it establishes, that one is a very formidable seafarer, and that he might potentially get the opportunity to sail with Corlys, and that the other could join him. And that, the implication is made that Corlys owes them for something, but we don't really get a further explanation than that. It then cuts to a scene of Corlys and Rhaenys in bed, which is really the only proper scene that we get of these two, and their discussion is, of the fact that Daemon tends to fly and, do his own thing when he's needed most, and that he'll always kind of react on this because he doesn't like taking instruction, and that his issue is, basically the crown passing over him, and Rhaenys sympathises that the crown passed over her too, and that it's difficult to bear, but essentially that you need to for the sake of your people. So back at Dragonstone, we have Rhaenyra situated in her library, and she brings Mysaria to question her about her involvement in the murder of Prince Jaehaerys, and to try and get any information that she may know or have provided to Daemon. And after this conversation, Rhaenyra realizes who Mysaria is, after Mysaria drops some very unsubtle hints, and eventually states that she's not going to follow up on her husband's word, and that she's going to instead put her back in the cells because it doesn't benefit her to release her. It doesn't benefit her in that she would either be losing an asset, or that Mysaria could potentially go and put her in a very dangerous position in terms of communicating with the Greens. This is immediately followed by a scene of Adam of Hull going out and collecting clams and crabs at the beach, and then we see sea smoke flying over the top of him. A really beautiful scene, and excited to see where it goes. So we then juxtapose that really beautiful and picturesque scene with this really vile scene of all the rat catchers from the Red Keep being hung in the streets of King's Landing. And we're introduced to this by a character where there's speculation that he may become a more significant character in the plot going forward. This grey-haired man who is walking through the street and bumps into this woman who turns around, and she realizes, that all these bodies are hanging above her, and she looks up and gasps and says, "My son." And then we see a series of women who are on the floor and flailing and sobbing. And again, it's just this knock-on effect of seeing mothers grieve the loss of their sons, which is obviously something we're going to see a lot of throughout this war. Otto Hightower, Hand of the King, then goes to the King and Criston Cole to react to Aegon's decision to have every rat catcher hung publicly. So Otto enters the room. He's absolutely furious, and he starts to call Aegon out, and Criston Cole's, trying to do the whole have some decorum, beware how you speak of your king. And Otto is like, I am his grandsire and I will speak to him as I wish. And essentially he does say that he is a fool. And so then we have this interaction where he's just completely enraged and, is calling out the fact that Aegon has absolutely no political sense, that he has no restraint, that after, all the trauma of dragging the body of Jaehaerys through the town and sitting Alicent and Helena on this procession behind him and putting them through this really difficult time to try and gain the sympathies of the small folk and to try and, blacken the name of Rhaenyra Targaryen, that Aegon has essentially gone and undone all of that work that they did to try and build these relations with the small folk, because he has gone and hung all of the rat catchers, of which there was many in the Red Keep. And now that all of the women, all of their wives and mothers and children are all at the gates mourning and having this outpouring of grief and essentially casting down the name of King Aegon because he is the one responsible for the death of their loved one. And it's this lack of mercy that is again showing how the small folk are the ones that really suffer when it comes to the royals warring amongst themselves. This is a very long and significant scene, but I'm going to try and keep this brief because I know this video is going to be really long. Essentially Otto is demoted, and this comes off the back of, again, this outpouring, but also he is trying to, do all this writing back and forth politics, and Aegon says, I want to spill blood, not ink. And so instead he takes the hand of the king pin and instructs Otto to give it to Kristen Cole, who is going to be his new hand of the king. And Aegon declares, "My new hand will be a steel fist," which really shows, his state of mind and where the civil war is going. But something that really, really stuck out to me and says a lot about Otto's character more than anything is the fact that he says that Viserys was right about him, because he essentially says, "You've destroyed the legacy of your father and you have no respect for his legacy." And he was like, "He was right about you." And Aegon says, "He made me king," which you do have to pity his naivety. But Otto says, "Is that what you think?" He starts laughing and says, "Is that what you think?" And this really just shows that maybe he wasn't the best hand of the king. The fact that he completely and utterly does not believe Alicent when she comes in and says that, Viserys has changed his mind on his deathbed and wants them to crown Aegon as king. He completely didn't believe that. He was going to install him either way, and we knew that much, but it's the fact that he doesn't believe a word of what Alicent said, and really just shows how neglectful of a hand he was, and how he actually doesn't care about the legacy of Viserys either, because he went against his wishes in who his heir was going to be, who's going to succeed him, and went and instead usurped the throne and installed his grandson. We then return to Dragonstone, where we have this scene with Rhaenyra and Mysaria in the cells. So Rhaenyra goes and says that she is going to go through with the words of her house. She is going to let Mysaria go, and that one of Corlys's ships is waiting in the bay to make passage to Essos, and that she is going to grant Mysaria safe passage on the ship. So she instructs Eric Cargill to walk her down to the gates, and that then she will continue on her journey. On the way down the mountain, down to the coast to get aboard the ship, she passes Eric Cargill, who is coming up from the shore, and the intended plan was that people were going to mistake him with his brother, and so that he is going to be able to make his way through the castle without arousing suspicion. However, she has just been with his brother and knows he is still within the castle walls, so as she passes Eric, she stops and goes back up and warns the brother, presumably. We don't really see who she actually warns, but presumably she warns the brother. He then bursts into the room as Eric traverses the halls, gets into Rhaenyra's bedchambers and pulls a sword on her. Eric then bursts into the room, screaming "brother," so we can only assume that Mysaria did tell him. And then we have the twin showdown, the two brothers fighting to the death, and this was the most heartbreaking thing. It was so emotive, and I think they did such a good job with how they carried it out. There's these conflicting stories within the source material that it was over almost immediately, and then there was another one that it went on for hours, and in the initial story, when it was over immediately, they were declaring their hatred for each other. But whenever the other source said that it went on for hours, they were talking about how they were declaring their love for each other, and it was really long and laborious and drawn out. I think this was the perfect length, and it had enough of the resentment that you left us and you put us in this position where we have to fight now. But then it also had the scenes where they were crying and hugging each other and had their heads together and saying, "I still love you, brother." And it was just absolutely heartbreaking. It was worse than Clegane Bowl. Absolutely worse. I would have been happy enough to finish the episode there. I think it would have been a very emotive end. But we do go back to King's Landing for the end of the episode. And we initially have the scene with Otto and Alicent as he's telling her that he has been removed as Hand of the King and that Kristen Cole has instead been installed. And, they have this really emotive conversation. We finally get confirmation of Daeron Targaryen and that he is in Old Town. So finally, we had a lot of revelations this episode. We finally got Daeron confirmed. We finally had the scene where Rhaenys bursts through the floor during the coronation. We had that addressed. And also that Aemon Targaryen has some serious mommy issues, but sure, we knew that already. But yeah, we have this conversation between Otto and Alicent, and he's talking about going back to Old Town. She suggests going to Highgarden. Not entirely sure where he's going to end up going, but they do have this kind of emotive scene. It feels like they're finally on the same page, but it's taken right to the end where he no longer has a place in King's Landing anymore, and their relationship was just about getting to the stage of healing and respecting each other and seeing each other as equals, and all of a sudden it's ripped away. But Otto does declare that we still may yet prevail to bring forth peace. So there is this idea that there still is going to be this interaction between the two. But then she goes off and goes to Aegon's room, presumably to chastise him for, dismissing Otto. But she goes in and he's sitting by the fire, really, really in a state of disarray. He's completely disheveled. He's emotionally distraught. He's bawling his eyes out, and he's playing with the rings that he has on, almost in the same anxious way that she was picking at her fingers in her youth, and that we even seen at the end of last season. We also seen, that Viserys had a tendency to play with his rings and his jewelry and stuff whenever he was agitated. So we do see these reflections of parenthood in the children, and we see that he is having this emotional outpouring, but that Alicent still isn't, at the space where she has the emotional capacity, as a teenage parent to these children, now as an adult, and to these adult children, she still doesn't have the emotional capacity to actually connect with them. And so she leaves the room and goes back to her room. And so we end the episode in the bedchambers of Alicent Hightower, where she walks in and sees Criston Cole. He does not have any of his armor on and is sitting on the edge of the bed. He gets up to greet her. She slaps him a few times, shoves him. He grabs her by the wrists and slams her into the wall. And then they descend into an amorous scene. And this is how we end the episode. It's very interesting that they've ended the last 2 episodes like this. I wonder if it's going to continue. But yeah, a very interesting episode, very impactful, really, really enjoyable, really, really moving in every single way. And I'm interested to see what they're going to do next week. So we'll check back on then.